The Fairer Sex, Short Stories on Male Privilege, Number 18, The Frying Pan. My honeymoon was memorable for less usual reasons. It was the first time my wife assaulted me. It happened like this. We were lounging by the hotel pool, my wife dozing, or seemingly so, while I had my head in an academic journal, as I'm a history lecturer. That was how it all started, the Journal of Patriarchal History. The research which so fascinated me, an analysis of a plasterwork frieze in Montacute House, Somerset, brought on one of those ironical, delicious and woeful realizations that make history so rewarding a subject. I mean, when you realize that things have not changed, that things have not improved, that things are no better, because simply human nature is just the same. We have the same problems as always, it's just that they take different forms. History rhymes rather than repeats, a saying mistakenly attributed to Mark Twain. As a result, I looked up and made one of those non-verbal sounds of appreciation, a slight exhalation, a slight smile, a slight chortle. I was then ambushed, for repeated blows to my head were administered by my wife with her rolled-up magazine, along with, for good measure, some shoves and pushes. I raised my arms to defend myself, but the blows, the shoving, and the pushing continued. "How dare you!" she kept shouting. "How dare you!" Changing her grip on the rolled-up magazine, she brought it down dagger-like. The pool was crowded, and I was greatly embarrassed. I glanced around, while defending myself with raised arms. I saw rubberneckers, blatant as well as furtive, and smiles, amused as well as embarrassed. There was also schadenfreude, lots and lots of schadenfreude, a superabundance. A woman in a red bikini walked by, turning her head as she did so, feasting her eyes with relish and smiling. Passing us, she even turned and walked backwards a few paces. "You go, girl," she shouted. "Serves him right." She laughed and punched the air jubilantly, for, although the nature of my transgression was unknown to her, in her eyes I was not only guilty, but also condignly punished. I began pushing back, and made a grab or two at my wife's magazine. At this, a couple of men whose faces had formerly displayed so much schadenfreude rushed over to us. "Hey, hey," one of them said, "men don't hit ladies," while the other restrained my arms. When my wife calmed down, she disclosed the nature of my transgression. When I had looked up from my journal, and given that slight exhalation, slight smile, and slight chortle, my eyes had rested, seemingly, on a concatenation of curves that reclined on the opposite side of the pool. I explained to my wife that, rather than savouring these sinuous curves, I had in fact been examining the contents of my own head. Today I wonder how I did not see my wife's ambush as a warning of things to come. What I remember most of all is convincing myself that this was a one-off. A few months into our marriage, one morning while I was leaving for campus, my wife came to me with a university publication in which my department was featured and which she had found in my study. She asked why I had kept this from her. I replied that I had not kept it, I had just not thought about it. She prodded a photograph with her forefinger and asked if I thought this female lecturer pretty. Now wary, I shrugged and replied non-committally. She asked if this lecturer would be joining me later that year for the conference in Italy. I said I had no idea. My wife shouted she knew what men are like, and that I had better behave myself. She began yelling a few inches from my face. I felt her spittle on my cheeks. I backed away, but she advanced towards me. I nearly fell over a chair. She chased me around, shouting repeatedly, "Don't you dare walk away from me!" And each time we were stationary, she used her fingernails on my face. When I escaped from the house, I ran for the car. As I drove off, in the rear view mirror I saw my wife standing in the driveway. She appeared to be crying. Borderline personality disorder came to my mind. I pulled over, briefly to examine my face. I counted 9 scratches in all. 6 lay in random directions, as if I'd forced my way through a prickly hedge, but 3 of them, across my right cheek and at an angle of 45 degrees, demarcated a facial motorway, their cause obvious to the naivest observer. Some of the other scratches were shallow, but these 3 were weeping red tears. I detoured to a department store and went to the ladies' cosmetics section to enquire about makeup. Perhaps I could disguise these injuries. When I walked up to the counter, the saleswoman eyed the scratches on my face. She asked what had happened to me. I said I'd rather not talk about it. A jealous woman, no doubt, she said, smiling. But when I failed to respond appreciatively, the smile in her eyes disappeared and remained in her lips only. When I gave my lecture that morning, 2 scratches still seeped slightly, but it was not just that. I realized I was still shaken. There were tremors in my voice, which the students almost certainly noticed. I had difficulty keeping my mind on the lecture. I repeated needlessly, corrected myself numerous times, and stuttered, things I never otherwise do. Throughout the day, face-to-face conversations with colleagues and students followed a similar pattern. Roving eyes would take a tour of my face, wondering and wandering, before looping back to my own eyes. Unsatisfied and evidently still curious, some eyes took several such excursions, but only one person ever asked what had happened. I said I had fallen into a cupboard. In the refectory, at lunchtime, a man and a woman were talking a few yards away. The man looked at me, found that I returned his gaze, then quickly looked back to the woman. He said something I couldn't hear. Probably just defending herself, I overheard the woman say, laughing. My wife and I were both wine bibbers, but I learned to fear the wine bibbing. This was because of the way my wife flipped. It always happened at the same point, 3/4 of a bottle. When conversing pleasantly, I would say something wholly innocuous, or seemingly so, at least to me, at which point my wife's face would assume an angry expression, and she would yell her screed, which I came to know very well, as many items reappeared each time. I found her ugly. I had never got anywhere because I was useless. My mother was an obnoxious bitch. I spent too much time working. I never helped around the house. I leered at other women. She would push, shove, and scratch, and throw the nearest object, the TV remote, a book, a piece of fruit, a shoe. On her first few flips, I tried to reason with her, to calm her down, to bring her back from this irascible state, but I never succeeded, not once, and gave up. Sleep was the only cure. Yet when she sobered up, she was ignorant of her conduct, or at least said so. Curiously, however, when we drank in public, never once did she flip. Night times were now tortuous affairs. Prior to my marriage I fell asleep easily, as I was able, like some electronic device, to switch off, whereas my wife, since she was worrisome by nature, would lie awake on the slightest of vexation. I suppose she resented the ease with which I slept, in so far as she would, after waiting patiently until I gave signs of sleep, by my slower and deeper pattern of breathing, administer a prod or a shove, then begin berating me, that her problems were nothing to me, that I was useless, that I worked too much, that I did not love her, etc. As the months advanced, the prods and shoves turned into kicks and punches. This disruption of sleep, so capriciously and callously administered, affected my nervous system, as I now developed a sleep disorder. We all have the experience, albeit rarely, of reaching the threshold of slumber, only to jolt awake, yet we can divine no cause. This behaviour is possibly a relic of primitive instinct, left over from our arboreal ancestry, in which a fall from height might prove fatal. Only in my case, the threshold of slumber was now an insurmountable hurdle. I would feel myself sink down, and down, and down, then wake involuntarily with a jolt. Imagine, if you will, a soldier on guard duty at night, desperately tired, and knowing that if found asleep at his post, he would be court-martialed and shot. Imagine how such a soldier would respond on realizing his eyelids have fallen. In my own case, my body's sleep program, if you will, was suddenly interrupted by some primeval survival mechanism. I would emit a non-verbal sound, and an arm or leg would leap, seemingly of its own will, and I would then regain full consciousness. Since this disturbed my wife, I would receive a fresh round of admonishment. We now agreed that I would move into the spare bedroom. Each night, however, I placed an ornamental stand behind the door, which would overturn noisily should the door open. I rarely, however, slept until 4 a.m., and even then it was shallow and unrestorative. Obviously this took an inevitable toll on my constitution. I sought out a psychotherapist. However, I had one consultation only. At first, the therapist thought I was there for myself, but then I explained the problems my wife was having. He said he should see my wife rather than me. I said it was her husband, that it was my duty to help her, to look after her, that I loved her, that I wished to be a more empathetic partner, that I should start by obtaining professional advice. He looked at me strangely, and asked if I thought I might be a victim of domestic abuse. At this I grew angry, and told him that I was not a victim of domestic abuse. I was only there to help my wife in whatever way I could. He asked me if I knew what white knight syndrome was. I said that this was going nowhere useful. I made my excuses and left. Even so, wiser counsel began exerting itself, albeit slowly, as I pondered the therapist's curious remarks. I recalled seeing some relevant leaflets, posters, and flyers at the local library, and went to consult them. They depicted, without exception, a woman cowering beneath a mail fist. I found similar leaflets at the GP's surgery. Internet sites were also illuminating. On the home page of one such site, which was dominated by references to female victims of domestic abuse, I spotted a small hyperlink: Men and Domestic Abuse. When I clicked on this, I was taken to another web page with two hyperlinks. One was I am abused, and the other was I am an abuser. I called 3 or 4 domestic abuse helplines. The first one greeted me with this automated statement: "You are not alone. Thousands of women are being abused just like you." When I got through, I found that they only helped women. I said that the helpline was state-funded. The woman replied that men do not suffer like women, that men can take care of themselves. They do not need help like women. In the background, a female voice said, "It happens to men too, you know." There were then several laughs. Another helpline was open 24/7. When I called this number, I was given an alternative one for men, which, as it happened, was open 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., 5 days a week. The woman who answered sounded sympathetic, but then she said, What evidence can you provide to show that you are the victim? She went on to say that male users call this service to learn how to game the system. I asked if the other line screened women the same way as men. She said that they did not screen anyone. I will pass on quickly through the next 3 years, during which my wife was violent, I would guess, on about 20 occasions, and by which time we had 2 children, a boy and a girl. During these 3 years, I told stories about my injuries to relatives, friends, and colleagues. I have worked from home to avoid scrutiny. I felt shamed and embarrassed. I realized how the battered husband appears as a regular trope in TV comedy. I knew that if I told anyone, the word henpecked would appear on the horizon. In retrospect, I now know that I was enormously lucky on one occasion, because on punching me in the face, my wife broke her finger. Such a husband, as I will explain, is then in a very risky position. I will proceed to my wife's last assault, which was, as it happens, another ambush. As I came through the front door, I was smashed in the face with a frying pan. Spots of blood landed on the wallpaper. My wife wanted to know where I'd been. While managing the pain and holding my nose, I said I'd been at my night class, as she well knew. She said she did not believe me. She knew, apparently, that students sometimes show up for the first class but are never seen again because night classes are used as cover for adulterous liaisons. I was unable to placate her, and fearing another blow, I held her by the forearms while she twisted and turned. The screaming and the yelling, though, continued. She escaped, ran to the kitchen, and then began throwing things. A new screed commenced. I would not be believed. I would not get custody. I would never see our children again. I would be turned out of the house. No one else would want me. I would end up in a bedsit. I would have pocket money only, while she took everything else. During this screed, flying plates smashed against the wall, their smithers a testimony to her unmanaged and wholly delusional anger. The doorbell rang. It was immediately followed by loud knocking. We both froze in tableau vivant, and 2 or 3 seconds of silence ensued. "This is the police," shouted a male voice. "Open up." The knocking now gave way to a thumping. I opened the door. "We've been called to a disturbance," said Officer 1, a huge man. "My wife's assaulted me," I said, letting the 2 police officers in while holding a reddening handkerchief to my nose. I saw my trail of blood on the hall carpet. "Shut up and stand over there," said Officer 1. "Hey, hang on," I said. "I told you, shut up." The raised forefinger was palm outwards, other fingers clenched. 2 seconds of silence, eye to eye. "Stand over there." The forefinger fell through a right angle, now pointing to the bay window. 2 seconds of silence, still eye to eye. "I won't tell you again." I obeyed. I was a cur confined to his basket. Officer 1 now joined Officer 2, a dumpy woman. The two of them began talking quietly to my wife. "Are you all right, love?" Officer 2 said with extreme solicitousness. My wife was crying. The conversation continued inaudibly for a few minutes. While my wife spoke, Officer 2 looked in my direction a few times. The 2 officers scrutinized my wife's forearms closely. Presently my wife went back into the kitchen, and the 2 officers strode over to me. "Is this yours?" asked Officer 1, picking the wine bottle up from the coffee table. He held it up to the light, swilled it, ascertained its emptiness, and put it down. "It's my wife's," I said. "I've not touched anything this evening." "Oh," said Officer 1. He leaned forward and sniffed, then put the wine bottle down, having lost all interest in it. "Your wife has bruises on her forearms," said Officer 2. They look rather like finger marks, as if she's been grabbed forcefully. What do you have to say about that?" In saying this, Officer 2 came closer, waddling slightly and folding her arms, maintaining eye contact and frowning at me. "Well, obviously I had to restrain her. She went berserk," I said. "Why?" asked Officer 1, also with arms folded. "What did you do?" "Done? Nothing. How on earth do you think I got this?" I pointed to my nose. "Do you think I whacked myself in the nose with a frying pan?" "Women don't do that sort of thing without good reason," said Officer 2. "She says that you're argumentative." "What?" I said incredulously. "It was a sneak attack, a complete surprise." "Look, we don't know what happened," said Officer 1, feigning emollients. "We weren't here. For all we know, you attacked your wife, and she was just defending herself." "She struck first," I said. "Well, some women do strike first. They're still defending themselves. They're fearful. They can't afford to risk the man striking first. Your wife says she's afraid of you, of what you might do." "She's afraid of me," I said. "I'm afraid of her." The two officers grinned, while exhaling gusts of disbelief. "You're afraid of her," said Officer 1. "What are you, 6'2", 6'3"? Look how short she is. A tall man isn't afraid of a short man unless he's a wimp, that is, so why are you afraid of a woman? You need to man up." "Grow a pair," said Officer 2. Well, the upshot was this. They arrested me as the primary aggressor. I was cuffed, then escorted through the front garden to the waiting police car, in front of an audience of twitching curtains. A hand was placed on my head, as if my body was unlikely to assume a sitting position without guidance. As I ducked down, I saw a group of students walking along the other side of the road, all of whom were looking at me. I recognized one of them from my own tutorial group. The machinery of the state then swung into action, and it assumed the pre-programmed role as my wife's protector. The whole affair ended up in court. The magistrate gave me a simple choice: defend myself legally, with my wife as my adversary, state-funded and state-defended, of course, or attend a course. I took the path of least resistance. I attended the course. It was called Men Exploring Non-Violent Solutions. I asked my solicitor if there was a complementary Women Exploring Non-Violent Solutions. He laughed, rather like the magistrate had when I said I was frightened of my wife. This course, which cost me a week's salary, was run by Deluge, a charity that ran a woman-only domestic violence helpline, and to whose coffers I was now contributing at the insistence of the state. This course followed the Duluth model, which I quickly learned is a feminist-driven concept of domestic violence. We were told that domestic violence is a crime committed against women because they are women, that domestic violence stems from society's misogyny, and that domestic violence is part of the patriarchal power structure. We learned how male violence stems from unequal gender relations, toxic masculinity, and male privilege. The domestic environment, we were told, effectively cages women with wild animals, something men never comprehend. Yet these men faced similar situations to myself. I saw no evidence that they were wild animals, nor did any of them articulate any particular desire to control or subjugate their wives. Rather, they had called the police, some of them with visible injuries, only to find themselves the ones arrested. Or they had gone to the police, only to face blunt refusals to do anything at all. They were told often that wives only act in self-defense, that male abusers pretend to be victims. The official policy seemed to be this: if a man beats his wife, then arrest the man, and if a woman beats her husband, then arrest the man. We all agreed between ourselves, that is, that if your wife kicks off, then you must get away, and you must never call the police. This is because if your wife suffers so much as a broken fingernail, then, even with a knife sticking out of you, you were nonetheless deemed the primary aggressor. One attendee had called a helpline only to find, an hour later, 2 police officers on his doorstep. His number had been passed to the police and traced. The police were there to establish if his wife was safe. We all sat in a circle, each man being invited in turn to confess his sins. When it was my turn, I failed to show the required contrition, much to the instructor's annoyance. I explained how wine caused my wife to flip, and someone suggested I might record her during these episodes, surreptitiously, of course, as evidence. At this the instructor grew angry. She said that alcohol was not responsible for domestic violence, and that if your wife drinks, then it's because of the patriarchy. I also said my wife had mental issues, possibly borderline personality disorder. The instructor claimed I was in denial, or that I did not realize I was really an abuser. This anger management course changed my life, but not in the way its organizers intended, because I already knew I could manage my anger. I have a pacific temperament. This next may seem a strange remark. Only at this point did I begin seeing myself as a victim and begin retaking control of my life. Equally important was that I no longer regarded it as my task to help my wife. By this time, I had researched the subject of domestic violence extensively for myself, and I was able to challenge every statement on the course. The instructor, however, did not appear to embrace my corrections with any zeal. We were told that perpetrators are overwhelmingly men, a statement that is not only ubiquitous, but also accepted uncritically. I asked for a more precise figure. The instructor was unsure, but suggested that overwhelmingly meant 98 or 99%. I then cited the Office of National Statistics, or ONS, a governmental department that our own government continues to ignore, even while promulgating our nation's domestic abuse laws. According to the ONS, 1 in 3 victims are men, but that is conservative, as it ignores those who remain silent, those who do not yet recognize themselves as victims, and those who the police choose to ignore. I referred to Erin Pizzey, the founder of the Women's Refuge movement, who realized that women can be just as violent as their husbands, and she received death threats for saying so. We were told that men have the advantage, being bigger and stronger. I said that women are far more likely to launch sneak attacks, waiting until a man is preoccupied, until his back is turned, or until he is asleep. I said that women are far more likely to use weapons, even if it's a kettle, an iron, a shoe, or a frying pan. I said that women are far more likely to throw things. I said that women are far more likely to use boiling or caustic liquids. I said that women pay other men to carry out assaults, yet this escapes the statistics since it is not classified as domestic violence. I asked for evidence that the Duluth model worked, in the sense that it reduced the frequency of domestic violence. No evidence was provided. At this point, I drew out a sheaf of research showing that no, it did not work, for there was no solid empirical evidence to support it. I said that men would rather not strike women. I said that male instinct was not to attack women, but to protect them. I said that violent women exploited men's reluctance to strike back. Finally, I likened this course to a Maoist re-education camp where ideology mattered more than evidence, facts, data, or statistics. I was, of course, identified as a troublemaker, taken aside more than once to be berated and warned. Eventually I was thrown off this course as a disruptive influence and ended up back in front of the magistrate. The magistrate was puzzled, and when the situation was explained to him, he said that Deluge were not allowed to throw me off the course. I was to attend. Deluge were not present, but responded by letter with a denial, claiming falsely that I had said my wife was crazy, that I was in denial, and that I could not recognize myself as an abuser. My case fell into legal limbo and then into abeyance because I had now resolved to leave my wife. To this day, I still have a battle to see my children. My wife routinely stymies my visitation rights, and the family courts refuse to enforce their decisions. But that is another story. My sleep disorder did not disappear suddenly. It just grew less frequent with passing time, and I now get it once or twice a month. However, I no longer sleep with an ornamental stand behind the bedroom door. I will end with how I began, namely Montacute House and its remarkable plasterwork frieze. This artwork, which is found in the Great Hall, tells a story in two frames. On the left, a woman hammers her husband's head with a clog. On the right, her husband sits painfully astride a pole while paraded around as a public spectacle. This, an extrajudicial form of punishment, is an ancient custom known variously as the Skimity Ride, or the Skimmington Ride, or the Charivari. In other depictions on the same theme, a man is strapped down, abused by the crowd, and pelted with rotten fruit. The explanation is simple. In former times, the wife who battered her husband was not punished. Rather, her husband was punished for the crime of allowing his wife to batter him. History doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. The end.